Government Operations and Elections Committee will now reconvene. We'll start up directly with our list of testifiers. Is there a Bob Gahan from ARP here? And then we'll do kind of back and forth, I think, from opponents and supporters going forward. So is there a Yazdan Baksa here to go next?
Madam Chair, they were waiting. They were thinking we'd reconvene at 6, so they might be a little late.
Okay, well then I'll just go on the list as the order I had earlier listed. So is Sherry Knuth here? Okay, we'll have you on deck. And welcome to the committee, and if you could just identify yourself as you begin.
Madam Chair and members of the committee and my representative, Michael Beard, thank you for the opportunity to speak. Good evening, everybody. My name is Bob Gahan. I am from Shakopee and a member of AARP's Advocacy Leadership Team. AARP is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to addressing the needs and interests of Americans and Minnesotans over 50 years of age. I have copies of my testimony right here. You may think that I've got more pages here than are there, but that's not true. I had to enlarge this to 16 point to read, one of the functions of aging, I guess. As a senior in Minnesota and Scott County, I am particularly proud of our high voter turnout. Scott County is one of the highest counties in the state for turnout, and I'm extremely proud of that. It indicates a high level of civic engagement. AARP believes that requiring a photo ID will create unnecessary and costly burdens for many older voters and will hamper the ability of many older Minnesotans to vote. We are very concerned if this requirement is put into the Constitution rather than in statute, we would be putting the right to vote for many elderly and disabled at great risk. This will affect not just my generation of voters, but future generations as well. A new photo ID requirement will disproportionately affect older voters because they are substantially less likely to have required current photo identification. Nearly 1 in 5 citizens over 65 lack a current government-issued photo ID, according to the Brennan Center for Justice. Most Minnesotans, including, I would imagine, everyone in this room, will be able to use a driver's license. I'm sorry, my time is up. If I beg for just one more moment.
You can have another couple seconds, but I do want to make it fair to everyone, the people that testified this
Understood.
morning.
I didn't know they were under a 2-minute.
Oh, sorry. I should have announced that. We are under the same 2-minute timeline since we carried that through this morning.
Okay, for some voters, including my mother-in-law, she will never be able to get a birth certificate. She was a live birth in a home. For others, it will be possible to get it, but very costly. While the voter ID itself may be free, voters, especially women, will need to find and purchase copies of birth certificates, marriage licenses, divorce decrees, and other documents to show name changes. It's ironic we should be discussing this on International Women's Day. I urge you to oppose this effort. Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you. Next on the list is Sherry Knuth, and Jeffrey Martin will be next, if he's here.
Madam Chair, while we're waiting, I just want AARP to know that absolutely we will welcome working with AARP to take care of their seniors as we will with any other group.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Sherry Knuth, and I am the Public Policy Coordinator for League of Women Voters Minnesota, a nonpartisan political organization that formed 91 years ago when women, after 70 years of effort, finally secured the right to vote. Because of our origins and history, every citizen's right to vote is important to us. This bill proposes changes in the state constitution, a document that establishes principles of government and basic rights of citizens. A voting procedure such as presenting a photo ID before casting a ballot has no place in any constitution. Voting procedures should be in statute. I will address a few reasons why this requirement should not be in our Constitution. The amendment would tie the hands of future legislators, limiting their ability to craft solutions for groups of voters who will face significant problems obtaining a government-issued photo ID. Last year, as the photo ID bill moved through the legislature, negotiations resulted in exceptions for certain groups of voters, including veterans living in veterans' homes, women in a shelter for battered women, and elderly living in residential facilities. A constitutional amendment would prevent future legislatures from creating such exceptions. Second, this amendment ties our voting procedures to photo IDs and provisional ballots, when better technology may make those things obsolete in the future. Third, it is uncertain how the amendment will affect Election Day registration, absentee balloting, and mail-in. We cannot know how the language substantially equivalent identity and eligibility verification will be interpreted by future legislatures or the courts. These forms of registration and voting are very popular in our state. They are used by citizens from all walks of life. Fourth, at a time when state and local coffers are strained, this proposed amendment kicks down the road the question of what implementation of a photo ID requirement would cost the state and local governments. In closing, League of Women Voters urges the committee to reject this bill and to consider alternatives to placing this kind of a clause in our state constitution. Thank you.
Thank you. Next on the list is Jeffrey Martin and then Kurt Rutzen. Is there a Jeffrey Martin here? Okay, good. Mr. Rutzen, would you like to go then? We'll give him an opportunity later if he shows up.
Thank you so much.
You bet.
I never knew how busy 94 can be at this time of day, so I appreciate you taking my testimony. Good afternoon. My name is Kurt Rutzen, and I'm with the ARC of Minnesota. I'm happy to be here with you all to discuss this bill. I oppose this bill. Let me explain why. I don't think people realize what harm this could do to the poor and disabled, among others. The poor move maybe once a night, twice a night. You need a current address on your license. How can they keep up with this? They can't. Unless we don't care about the poor and the disabled. I don't know. Maybe we don't. First of all, the paperwork also to get a person a photo ID is very difficult to do if you can even locate it on the internet. Please bear with me. I'm out of breath here. My ILS worker, Bob, has told me some stories like this. She tried to get a client of hers an ID, and it took her 8+ hours to track down all the information for one person. First of all, locate the forms and print them out. And if the person has something missing, like a birth certificate or any number of things, that's back and forth, Metro Mobility, finding, walking. It takes a long time. Lots of people with disabilities don't drive, so that would take time and cost, like I said. And if any of you disagree with extra cost and time it takes, I challenge you to talk to myself, Steve Lawson, Ann Henry, or anybody else in the disability community. It takes a long, long time. It just does. It's 2 and 2. I think it's still 4. It just does. I want to end it with this, and I'm sorry, I'm going way over. But like I said, thank you for my chance to testify here and talk to any one of us if you have questions. But a TV ad says, I heard it again last night, when a crisis or a problem comes up, we come together as Minnesotans to figure out a solution and do the right thing. Well, people, here is one of those times. I challenge you to do the right thing and find the right solution that won't harm people with disabilities or the poor or the mentally ill. Like it or not, people, and someday, I mean, you gotta know this, but someday you may really know this. We are people too, just like you guys. We are. Like it or not. We're growing, we're growing, we're growing. Numbers and numbers and numbers. We are citizens too. We deserve the right to vote. Please vote no on this. I'm asking you, and let's find a solution for everybody be included. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Rutson. Is there Jeffrey Martin? We skipped over him. I thought so.
Madam Chair, I just want to clarify for the
Kiffmeyer.
record that you do not have to have your current address on a state ID or a driver's license and as part of this. That it is current law that many times we know people renew it, a receipt for it or something like that will be helpful. And I look forward to working with ARC Minnesota and making sure every single person with a disability is able to vote.
Thank you. And then I just wanted to remind everyone about the 2-minute limit, and Ms. Hanson will let you know what your time is. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Jeffry Martin. I'm the president of St. Paul NAACP. A brief statement to read into your record and for your consideration. Our nation is in the midst of the most aggressive attempt to roll back voting rights in over a century. A century ago, the target was the voting rights of black voters and other voters of color. The goal was to eliminate their presence at the polls to accelerate the spread of racial segregation. Today, the target is the voting rights of black voters, Latino voters, Asian American voters, Native American voters, as well as students and young people, seniors, working men and women, and immigrants of all colors. These are also among the voting demographics who are most likely to support worker rights, LGBT rights, environmental protection, and peace. A century ago, their tactics were varied, such as grandfather clauses, poll taxes, and racially motivated ex-felon voting bans. Today, voting suppression also takes many forms, including attacks on early and Sunday voting to make voting harder for working people. Photo ID requirements such as this one for voting and registration that introduced the first financial barriers to voting since the poll tax, and the same racially motivated ex-felon laws. Attacking voting rights was un-American then. Attacking voting rights is un-American now. We as a people rose to challenge then. We as a people must meet the challenge now. So it's time for each of us in the audience and even those who are sitting here to challenge and to remind America that this is my vote, each and one of our individual vote, and we will work together to defend and protect our constitutional right. Thank you for your time.
No. Thank you. Next on the list is there a Sadiq Warfa? Let's see. Is there does Yazdan Baksa or Chris Barden here? Nope, we'll keep going. Wait for people to filter in. Is there an Alex Erickson?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, my name is Alex Erickson. I'm a student at the University of Minnesota, and I'm also a veteran of Operation Iraqi Freedom. I served in the Army for 3 years as a cavalry scout. I was deployed to Iraq from December 07 to February 09. In the second year away from friends, families, and relatives, I had the honor of witnessing the January 31st, 2009 Iraqi provincial elections. It was at that point that I realized that perhaps the right to vote in America was something I had perhaps overlooked, and it cannot be overstated how important this right to vote is. Because I value elections, I consider the current Secretary of State's opinion that absentee voting would be eliminated or drastically reduced, and casting provisional ballots and returning to a courthouse from Iraq, Afghanistan, or Kuwait within a certain amount of time would be nearly impossible. Also, asking Minnesotans to radically amend their democracy and voting rights on the ballot and then finalize the funding and policy details the next legislative session is backwards governance and highly irresponsible. And on behalf of veterans and active duty service members, those who would be most affected by photo ID and those who have made the most sacrifices to preserve our democracy and the 700,000 eligible Minnesota voters who would be impacted, I urge this committee to vote no. Democracy and voting rights are not a partisan issue. I take these attacks on our Constitution and voting rights personally, and I am not alone. And with that, I respectfully yield the rest of my time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam
Okay,
Chair, I just want to clarify
Representative
again that it is very important to recognize that substantially equivalent allows for absentee voting, and that our military and overseas voters, as the wife of a Vietnam veteran, as the daughter of a Navy veteran, I take that very, very seriously, and that we will absolutely protect the right of our soldiers and our overseas voters to cast their ballots through the usual UOCAVA voting process.
Thank you.
Madam Chair,
Oh, Representative Winkler.
are we permitted to follow up with Representative Kiffmeyer if she's following up with witnesses? Representative Kiffmeyer, we talked about this morning, and now you've said unequivocally that substantially equivalent identity and eligibility verification includes absentee ballots. But I don't understand why that is. I don't understand the argument, because the absentee ballot system we have now just requires you to write out a number. So without showing a photographic identification, or you can say that I don't have a social security number, or I don't have a driver's license, and I can still vote because I attest that I don't have one of those things. Yet if you show up at the polling place, your identity can only be shown through a government-issued photographic ID. So you have to have one at the polling place, or you can't vote. But if you want to vote by absentee, you can just say, I don't have one. I don't have such an ID, or I don't have such a number. How is that substantially equivalent?
Representative Kiffmeyer.
Madam Chair and Representative Winkler, the substantially equivalent allows us to conform with the U.S. Supreme Court decisions in regards to being able to clearly allow absentee ballots and to have that proof of identity or eligibility substantially equivalent. It doesn't mean exactly the same. It doesn't mean identical. It means to the ability to verify their identity and eligibility. And so for our overseas and military voters, many times for them, a passport or possibly a military ID would be a choice that the legislature might choose for them because of those kinds of circumstances. It is not, it says government issued ID, and government issued would be in that feasibility, as I would see it.
Representative Winkler.
Madam Chair, Representative Kiffmeyer, if a voter showed up on Election Day at the polling place without a government-issued ID and said, I don't have one, could they still vote without using the provisional balloting system? Could they just show up and have their vote counted?
Representative Kiffmeyer.
Madam Chair and Representative Winkler, in the polling place on Election Day, all voters must present a photo ID, and I think that that is quite clear in the constitutional amendment. But remember, on Election Day, you're actually standing right there. You're not in the unique circumstances of being over in the military or in another situation like that. When you've been able to come to the polling place on Election Day, you have abilities to have that ID. And just to mention to you as well, that in the Crawford decision, it rejected the argument that the law should be judged by the same strict standard applicable to a poll tax because the burden on voters was offset by the benefits. So I think that the court allows us, when we choose to use substantially equivalent, and that the state has a vested interest in making sure that we have the integrity of the election process, so that we have the flexibility when needed, especially for military, overseas voters, people who might be bedridden, can't get out of bed to come to the polling place. Those are justified, and the courts have recognized that. But if you're able to come to the polling place on Election Day, showing proof of your identity, presenting that, and eligibility verification and your residency, all those things are current Constitution, and you've been able to come to the polling place on Election Day, not only that, we give you an extra time to take care of the identity and eligibility by being able to go to a office and complete that process with a provisional ballot.
Madam Chair.
Representative Winkler.
Representative Kiffmeyer. Well, I mean, I guess what I'm hearing you say is that everybody has to show an ID, but if you are overseas and serving in the military or for some other reason, that would be an exception. What if, under current law, all you have to say is, I'm not able to be in my precinct on Election Day? Could a voter who doesn't have a Social Security number or a driver's license, or who didn't want to show it, simply say, can't be there can't be in my precinct on Election Day, I don't have, and check the box saying I don't have a Social Security number or a driver's license number, and then just have their absentee ballot counted? Could they do that under this amendment?
Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Representative Winkler, I'll read to you from the language of the bill. It says, a voter in a polling place on Election Day must present valid government-issued photographic identification before receiving a ballot. So I think it's stated quite clearly there. The exceptions that the court allows has to do when you have absentee voting, overseas voters, or unique circumstances that put you in a situation that coming to the polling place on Election Day may not be possible.
So,
Representative Winkler.
Madam Chair, Representative Kiffmeyer, so what I hear you saying is that we are preserving the absentee ballot system that we have, which does not require you to provide any kind of photographic identification or any kind of photographic verification. It allows you to not give a Social Security number or a driver's license number if you don't have one. And when we have, for example, cases where 30% of voters are voting by absentee, 30% of voters will not have any kind of ID requirement. That's what this amendment permits.
Representative Kiffmeyer.
Madam Chair and Representative Winkler, substantially equivalent identity and eligibility verification. And I think it says substantially equivalent. So it doesn't mean exempted from not having to have an ID. It means due to the circumstances of being an absentee voter, for whatever reason that may be, or an overseas voter, military voters like that, would have a substantially equivalent means to do identity and eligibility verification. By the way, probably one of the things that's different about absentee voting or even overseas voters is that they send in an application for an absentee ballot. When that application comes in, the election administration process goes into the system to see if they are already registered, check to see if maybe they're on a felon list. There may be some other things like that that the Secretary of State office does that he's talked about already. And that's part of receiving the absentee ballot already. And matter of fact, if they do not have an election registration already in the system, they will send them out a voter registration application to return with their actual ballot to expedite that whole process. But it's initiated when you already have an absentee ballot. And so it goes a little bit ahead of it as compared to Election Day, where somebody might come in and you don't know they're coming, whereas when it is an absentee ballot, you know, because they said, we want this. They've submitted an application. On that application is already a lot of information, and if there is other things that they need to do, that can be completed even before the absentee ballot goes out to them, and if anything else is needed, they can include that. So the process of absentee voting includes with it some functions already that are very helpful to comply with the substantially equivalent language.
Representative Winkler, I'm wondering if it seems like it's kind of the same line of questioning. Might you be willing to, and Representative Quam has a question too, but might you be willing to come back to it a little later after the witnesses, or do you want to proceed now?
Well, I guess I'm just confused, Madam Chair, so maybe some more testimony or something will enlighten me. As far as I can tell, this photo ID requirement that we're passing basically leaves out everybody who is voting by absentee. And if we just did mail balloting or absentee voting without a reason, there's really no gain except for the people who happen to show up at the polling place. So I'm a little confused about what actually the proponents of the bill are hoping to achieve by doing this.
Okay, let's go on to Representative Quam, and then I would like to get back to the testifiers.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In reviewing the Crawford v. Marion Court Board, Election Board, in the Stevens opinion, they reference that Burdock, with Burdock, the court applied the flexible standard set forth in Anderson, and then in Scalia's concurring judgment, it has the state draws no classifications, let alone discriminatory ones, except to establish optional absentee and provisional balloting. Now, obviously, the Supreme Court looked at absentee balloting, and they found that, yes, there is a difference. But, referencing back to Burdock and Anderson, they saw flexibility in allowing, and it was proper for the states to have that flexibility to establish optional absentee and provisional balloting. So I think your concern was addressed by the Supreme Court.
Representative Winkler.
Madam Chair, Representative Quam, I'm not sure if my concern was addressed by the Supreme Court, but my confusion about what you're hoping to accomplish with a constitutional amendment that leaves 30% of the electorate completely untouched by an ID requirement and creates the fairly artificial requirement that somebody who shows up at the polls doesn't need an ID, but nobody else does. My confusion is about how that helps achieve the voting integrity goals that are the stated intention of the amendment. It seems to me there's more of a focus on passing any kind of constitutional amendment to show that it's being done rather than to actually increase the voter integrity, because your amendment approach just leaves holes wide open.
We'll move on to the witness list, and we can come back to questions later. Okay, I'll start at the top again. Is there a Sadiq Warfa? No. Peter Rickmeyer? Hi.
Good afternoon. Thank you for allowing me to speak here today. First, I would like to remind everyone that in politics, perception is reality. However, it may not be the truth. And unfortunately, when politicians refuses to answer yes or no, they're giving out a perception versus the truth. And as a citizen and standing up for others, it seems to prolong the hearings, because then the politician or the person testifying has to re-answer the question 5, 6, 7, 10 times just because they won't answer yes or no. That's very unfortunate, and it wastes time, valuable time, because there's other things that can be done. With that being said,
Oh, and can I interrupt you just for a second? I forgot to have you identify yourself.
Peter Rickmeyer.
Thank you.
With that being said, I've looked at it in different forums, listening to the NCAA person speaking and other groups. I don't find it as a racial issue. I find it more of an educational issue. Most people that are well educated have photo IDs and will not be an issue. The uneducated people are the ones that are most affected. And the uneducated people are usually the ones that receive public assistance in those type of programs. And the perception, which may not be the truth, is that the Democrats support public programs where the Republicans don't. And so if a party wanted to make sure that they were elected in the next election, the easiest way to do it is by eliminating some of the Democratic voters. I would urge this committee to vote no. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Is there a William Riker? Randy Libio? Carter Glendening? Representative Erdahl?
Carter Glendening gave me his statement before he left and asked me to read it. So.
Okay, if you can read it in less than 2 minutes, Representative Erdahl.
Well, I'm going to actually edit. I will edit his version.
Thank you.
And I'll say
Start
this
now.
I will start now. I just want to make sure you understood this is Carter Glendening speaking and not me. 75 to 80% of Minnesotans want this photo ID amendment to vote according to many surveys taken by local press. This includes most Democrats. When we go to get food stamps, we need a picture ID. When we mail a package at the post office, they ask for a picture ID. When we renew our driver's license, they ask for a picture ID. But when we vote, the election judge is not allowed to ask for a photo ID. However, I can ask somebody to vouch for me who doesn't truly know me. I've been an election judge over the past 10 years. In 2010, a precinct in Ramsey County from the last election had more than 20% that listed as challenges, both for felonies as well as postal verification cards. These are unverifiable addresses. Of these two types, over 60% were in the unverifiable category. Since under current law, we election judges may not ask for a photo ID, there is nothing to prevent a person from memorizing a dead person's name and address and coming in to vote using the fraudulent name. It goes like this. The voter steps to the table. I ask his name, then I ask his address. He gives the name and address to me. I hand the voter a ballot. The voter votes. As you are aware, there are many votes that are fraudulent since the people voting are dead. You may say to yourself, this can't be. Here are some facts. In the 2008 Minnesota election, there were over 2,800 people who were dead and voted. Minnesota majority, apparently. In our nation, there were over 2.7 million people that have active registrations in 2 states from NPR Pew Research. Our Secretary of State, Mark Ritchie, has been asked repeatedly to clear up the registration list prior to the vote. Minnesota is one of only 5 states that allow same-day registration with third-party vouching. This has allowed 32,000 unverifiable people to vote in 2008 and another 7,000 in 2010. Integrity is being compromised.
Wrap it up.
I'm done. Carter Glendenning,
Okay.
Minnetonka.
Okay, is there a Harold Schertz? Jean Sanford? Dave Brown? Mr. Sulam, did you want to testify? I see you're back there.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, Ken Sulam with the Minnesota Association of Townships, but I'm also sharing concerns with the League of Cities, the County Association, and I believe the School Board Association, but we haven't had a chance to confirm all of their issues. I'm not here to talk about the policy of this bill. I'm here to talk about some of the concerns that we have as election administrators and those who have to train and educate the election administrators, that regardless of what is passed, we need to know how to make it work. And right now we have some very serious concerns with the bill as it's addressed. We had a very nice meeting with Representative Kiffmeyer yesterday to try to address some of those issues. I'll try to hit just 3 of the main ones. First is the effective date. With a June 30th effective date, there simply is no time from the day you guys pass the bill next spring for us to be able to educate our election officials, be able to buy the equipment, do the necessary training to get this implemented. There would be no time to do the public education that was discussed. There could be problems with people being able to get the necessary ID because we don't know what it'll be until you pass a bill. So we have very serious concerns about the effective date. We have concerns about some of the definitions, or more importantly, the lack of definitions, and in particular, the substantially equivalent. Contrary to what's been discussed, we don't believe the Crawford decision addresses this because Indiana does not have the term substantially equivalent in their statute. Therefore, the Supreme Court did not address that as a constitutional amendment. And so it does shed some serious doubt for us on our ability to do mail balloting and other absentee balloting should somebody bring a challenge. I understand it's not the intent. I fully appreciate that. But it is a serious risk of the unintended consequence. The last issue that I want to highlight, knowing that we're running low on time, is the idea of the cost factor that we have, because there are some serious expenses. Just doing some quick number crunching of what provisional balloting would cost local governments for a March town election. The lowest cost that I could estimate would be $1,000 and as high as $3,000 per March election.
Thank you very much. Well, I've run through there's several people that aren't here to testify that had wanted to testify, and that might be partially because of the evening hearing. So maybe at this time I'll see if there's more people. If we can we can see in a few minutes if there are more people that want to testify, but we can go back to some questioning now if you'd like. Question?
I think I should be on the list, but perhaps I'm not. Can I testify at this time?
Sure.
Okay, thank you. Madam Chair and members, my name is Marie Rigstead, and I'm the Public Policy Manager for Catholic Charities of St. Paul and Minneapolis. We're a service provider organization, and we have a variety of services in the Twin Cities area. We serve over 37,000 people each year with, like I said, a variety of services. And we do strongly oppose this bill. In an effort to be brief, I'll say that we have many concerns, a lot of which were talked about earlier, but one of our main concerns is the ability of our clients to obtain the documents that they need for ID, like their birth certificates. Just one example, some of the youth that live in our Hope Street Youth Shelter do not actually know what state they were born in. So these are people who have never had access to their own birth certificate, and they don't even know what state to get it in, much less have significant income to allow them to get their birth certificate. They're over 18, they're U.S. citizens, they don't have criminal records, and they have the exact same right to vote as you or I do. I do have a question, and maybe I can follow up with Representative Kiffmeyer later. I don't think this is the proper venue for a question. But I understand that a current address would not be needed on a photo ID to vote. But a lot of our clients don't have any address. And so they might have an ID that's expired with an old address on it. but they won't have any sort of documentation to show their current address. And so we use vouching right now, which has been a great system, worked well for our clients to be able to vote. My main point today is in response to a variety of comments that were made earlier today about what the next legislature will do if this amendment is put onto our Constitution. As I think you're all very aware, there's an election coming up in November, and there's no assurance of who will be part of the next legislature. And so assurances from the current legislature about what the next legislature will do are not really that helpful for us. And finally, just in closing, Representative Kiffmeyer stated a concern earlier that people who perceive fraud in our election feel disenfranchised. We are concerned that many people will actually be disenfranchised under this constitutional amendment. Thank you very much for letting me testify.
Okay, thank you. Any questions from the members at this time? We can, I guess, go to I understand there's an A1 amendment from Representative Simon. Perhaps you'd like to address that, Representative Simon?
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair and members. Well, I said my piece earlier today about how I strongly feel that a constitutional approach is the wrong approach for this, since Mississippi is the only state out of the 31 who has some identification requirement, photo or non-photo, who has done it that way. Every other legislature has seen fit to do it by statute. But I understand, I can count, so I understand that this amendment's going to pass this committee in all likelihood. So if we have to have a constitutional amendment, I would strongly prefer, and I hope you would agree, that we should do it in the most flexible way possible, because, of course, one of the disadvantages of a constitutional amendment is we are writing, in essence, in permanent ink. I don't know of any example in Minnesota history where a portion of the Constitution that we passed by amendment was then undone by an amendment. The only one I can think of on the federal level is prohibition. It was added as an amendment, and then we undid it. So is it possible that we can tweak it through another constitutional amendment later? Sure. But it's extremely unlikely. So that being the case, I think we should be as flexible as possible. So let me tell you what this amendment does. And actually, let me just ask staff, okay, great. There's a sheet, I think, being handed out now. Is that right, Bryn? Okay. So often, as you know, members, when we have an amendment, we're all sort of fumbling and trying to figure out, okay, what would it look like if this amendment went on, especially if it's not a delete everything amendment. So what I've done is handed out a sheet. It shows you what it would look like if this amendment went on. And basically what it does, as you can see, is it changes, and by the way, this handout is premised on the idea that if Representative Kiffmeyer's bill were to pass, in other words, current language assumes Representative Kiffmeyer's bill. So the changes in the underlining and the strikes correspond to her language, not current law. So as you'll see in the handout, which I think is easier to follow than the actual physical amendment, instead of talking about photographic identification and so forth, it just puts up in Section 1, I guess what now would be Section 1A of the Constitution, instead of having the word photograph there, it just talks about whose physical identity or likeness has been verified before voting in a manner prescribed by law. The idea there being presumably what we're really after here, or what the proponents are after, and what I'm willing to concede we'll have to do, is to talk about verification, whether it's based on physical identity or likeness. And I think, as I said in an earlier hearing, this driver's license is the means to an end. It shouldn't be the end in itself. I don't think we should get so hung up on whether a driver's license or photo ID is the be-all, end-all. The key thing is we care that that person is who he or she says he is. So I foresee a time when something like this might be obsolete. And I know we all think we're very cutting edge. We always do, whatever generation we live in or whatever year or day it is, we think nothing could get more modern than we are now. Well, 20 years ago, we might have put cassette tape in the Constitution, or 40 years ago, we might have put typewriter in the Constitution. I don't know whether in 20 years or 200 years this will be seen as kind of a quaint antique, and whether or not the whole idea of photographic identification, people might sort of laugh at it as being, from a bygone era. So why would we lock ourselves in for possibly hundreds of years by putting the word photograph in the Constitution? I know it seems almost silly and too futuristic, but I'm quite serious about it. We don't know what the technology is going to be. So to make it a little bit more neutral and not talk about photographic identification, and to put it in the passive voice so as to admit of the possibility that whether it's the poll book formulation that Secretary Ritchie was talking about earlier today, which I think has the beginnings of kind of a bipartisan win-win solution here. That's my editorial comment. But even if it's not that, there might be something else down the line, 10, 20, 200 years from now, that we've never thought of, beyond a retina scan or a fingerprint or something else. And I would really hate to put the word photograph in the Constitution. So while we think photographs will always be there, who knows what's going to be there in 100 or 200 years. So basically, as you can see here with this amendment, this is what it would look like. I would just substitute that language of physical identity or likeness verification. That's basically it. I haven't changed anything else. I object to having provisional ballots. I haven't changed that. The sole purpose of this amendment is to make clear that we're not going to put the word photograph in the Constitution, and it's all going to be about requiring physical identity or likeness verification, but getting away from this terminology, which we think is cutting edge and permanent, but may not always be. That's the amendment. You can see what it does, and I stand for questions, comments, criticisms.
Representative Kiffmeyer?
Madam Chair and Representative Simon, I appreciate your effort here. And however, this would still have language that would allow vouching. And I think that at this time, members, I would ask for a no vote on this amendment.
Representative Simon?
If I may, Madam Chair, I'm not sure that's true in the sense that this amendment doesn't touch, though I oppose, this amendment doesn't touch the language about substantially equivalent identity and eligibility verification. Again, I oppose that, and in a perfect world I wouldn't want it in there, but that seems to be, if I understand Representative Kiffmeyer, that is sort of the hedge against vouching, as I understand it, because it has to be substantially equivalent, and one person vouches, another person can't use a different form of identity or eligibility verification. So as I understood it, that was your sort of firewall against that possibility. I could be wrong, you're the author, but my intention was not to really touch that issue. It was to make sure we don't have the word photograph in the Constitution.
Representative Kiffmeyer?
Madam Chair and Representative Simon, I don't support this amendment. I don't think it accomplishes the goals that we have for voter identification.
Representative O'Driscoll?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Simon, you're suggesting wanting to remove all references to photographic identification. However, on the draft that you sent around, maybe I misunderstood. In item B, the sentence starts after the stricken language, the state must issue a photographic identification card. Is there an error in the amendment that we might want to be taking a look at, or?
Madam Chair, no. That was conscious on my part, although I'm open to the suggestion, only because photographic identification, I suppose, could still be one of the options. But who knows in 10 or 20 or 200 years whether it's the only option. So that was conscious, but I'm open to any other suggestion if you believe that that ought to be taken out as well.
Representative O'Driscoll?
Just because the author of the amendment had raised the question, and in his testimony 2 or 3 times had mentioned he wanted to strike the words photographic. I just wanted to see clarification on that particular reference in the amendment.
Okay. Any other questions for Representative Simon? Anybody that needs to talk specifically on this amendment? Not the.
Madam Chair, I'd like a roll call on it too.
Representative Simon requests a roll call having been requested. The clerk will take the roll.
Representative Pepin?
No.
Representative Murray?
No.
Representative Nelson?
Yes.
Representative Green?
Yes.
Representative Hancock?
No.
Representative Hornstein?
Yes.
Representative McFarland?
No.
Representative O'Driscoll?
No.
Representative Quam?
Negative.
Representative Sanders?
No.
Representative Scalzi?
Yes.
Representative Simon?
Yes.
Representative Erdahl?
No.
Representative Winkler?
Yes.
There being 6 ayes and 8 ayes, the motion does not prevail. We are back to the DE1 amendment. We do have a few more folks who were on the witness list that did still want to testify, so I'll give another opportunity for that. We'll take another break here with that. Sadiq Warfa. And I just wanted to remind you, because we weren't here earlier, you've got about 2 minutes, and then, what was the other person? And Rick Smithson. So, and then if you could just identify yourself for the tape before you begin.
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair and member of this committee. My name is Sadiq Warfa, spelled by S-A-D-I-K-W-A-R-F-A. Thank you for this opportunity to testify. Again, my name is Sadiq Warfa. I'm a proud new American, and I want to share with members of this body how proud I am to be a new citizen and being a part of this great American experiment, our democracy. Again, thank you for this opportunity to speak on behalf of Somali American throughout this great state of Minnesota. I'm here today to oppose the amendment that requires Minnesota voters to show photo ID when they're casting their vote, and I argue when you go to the floor to vote no. I believe that requiring photo ID will only take our state backwards. I strongly believe that what we need to do is continue and expand our Minnesota heritage and increasing voter participation. I'm very proud of our state because we lead the nation in providing election day voter registration. I want to say that the turnout of the Minnesota election is very high. I worry this new law will put unnecessary obstacles in the path of legitimate voters. Since our founding fathers, America has been moving towards a genuine equality. I'm mindful that it took a civil war, a 19th Amendment to guarantee a woman to vote, and then the Civil Rights of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to finally prohibit any prerequisite to voting. Thank you. I'll be watching to see how this bill progresses. Thank you, Madam.
Thank you. If you could, I just have one question for you. Did you say you were representing a particular, you said you were speaking on behalf of the Somali community. What was your group, for the record?
The record is the Somali Action Alliance.
Thank you. And then that's it. And then the next on the list was Rick Smithson.
Thank you. Again, my name is Rick Smithson. I'm not representing any group. I just came today because I've been an election judge pretty much every election for the last, since I moved to Minnesota 20 years ago. And so I just wanted to share a little bit of my experience. I don't do election judging because it's as a way to make money. I do it because it's actually a sacrifice. I do it because it's important. And the real value added in being an election judge is not pushing the papers around. It's ensuring that the vote is accurate. And that's why we spend hours each night making sure that the vote is counted accurately. But where that breaks down is when we don't know that somebody's only voting once. So I wanted to share an experience that we had. This was just a few years ago. It was the year that Al Franken was elected. We had an incident. I live in a small town of about 900 people. And we had, I'm not sure, I called one of the city council members today to ask him. It was somewhere between 10 and 13 people. Came and did a same-day registration. And I, by the way, I election judge all the time. So I've seen many instances like this, not necessarily this identical, but very similar ones. On this particular night, somewhere between 10 and 13 people showed up for same-day registration. They had all claimed the local laundromat address as their residence. When we challenged it, we called the state auditor's office and we were told that there was nothing we could do about it. We could not interfere with their right to vote, but that we could make note of it. That's how strong our laws are. When I went through election judge training, I was told if somebody wants to vote, there's really nothing you can do. There's nothing you can do to stop somebody from voting 3 or 4 times except report it after the fact. We need something that stops them before the fact. I want my vote and everybody else's vote to count. Thank you.
Thank you. There's still a few people that had requested to testify. Is there anyone here who had been requested to testify that hasn't had an opportunity to do so yet? Please come forward.
Can you hear me? My name is Randy Liebel. I am with the Tea Party organizations in the state of Minnesota, and I'm here today in support of the voter ID bill. There's over listening at the Senate hearing about 2-3 weeks ago, and then a lot today, I heard people talk about how this is going to disenfranchise them. And what I would like to say is that we're supposed to have faith that our government is capable of taking care of the tasks the government is assigned. In this case, we're assigning the government the ability to issue IDs to anybody who thinks they want one. And I think if the government isn't capable of that simple task, then how are they possibly capable of all the other things that they're trying to do? This is a simple task that the voter ID bill asks. It says everybody's got to have an ID to vote. And I think if we can't assume that our own government is capable of getting IDs to the people who need them, and that is such a simple task that I think we are, that we need to make sure that this gets done. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else that did not get a chance?
Good afternoon, committee members, and thank you for this opportunity. My name is Catherine Dorr. I am a Minneapolis Assistant Chair Election Judge, and I have been an election judge for 3 elections, including the Franken-Coleman Senate race. And just for the record, my precincts that I did serve in were adjacent to the University of Minnesota with a very heavy student population in our voting groups. I want to address the appropriateness of putting something like this on the ballot. My understanding of the Constitution and our governing documents, I am not a lawyer, I'm speaking only as a citizen and for myself, is that constitutions and things of that sort are to defend and determine what our rights are. They are to promote and enlarge the rights of citizens against dangers from within and without. They are not places to diminish or denigrate our rights. This is what this proposed bill will do. It will diminish and denigrate the rights of our citizens to vote. There is no need for this. We have checks and balances, as you have heard, and I believe that this amendment, among many others that are being proposed, are not appropriate for our Constitution. You've heard the policy debates last year and this year, and I think it is appropriate to talk about why this should or should not be on the ballot. Laws should be made that promote rights and not to deny them. I thank you, and if you have questions, you may ask.
Thank you. I think we've pretty much worked our way through the list. I'll give one more chance to Yazdan Baksa, Chris Barden, William Riker, Harold Schertz, or Gene Sanford. Any of those folks here? Okay, then it looks like we're closing out the testimony. Do we have additional questions from for Representative Kiffmeyer? Representative Scalzi.
Thank you, Ms. Chair. The most troubling thing I think I've heard today, other than the fact that somewhere between 20 and 30% of the people in our state won't have to present a photo ID, is the fact that the only other state in the nation that has put this into their constitution is Mississippi, as Representative Simon said. And when I hear a new person coming to our country, Mr. Sadiq Warfa, saying that this would take our state backwards, I can easily say that I think Mississippi is something I never wanted to be. It's troubling to me that we would be the same as Mississippi in the fact that we would put this in our Constitution. And I have to ask you, Representative Kiffmeyer, if that gives you pause to create a situation that we are the only state in the nation that would be equal to Mississippi by putting this in our Constitution.
Okay, and then we'll go to, that wasn't a question.
It was a question for...
Oh, it was a question. Okay, Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Scalzi. One of the most important things that we recognized when I was Secretary of State is that every time the Secretary of State or a member of that state walked into the room, it was always from the great state of New York, from the great state of Ohio, from the great state of Minnesota. And the one thing we learned to do is that we are the 50 states of the United States, and that we stand together and respect each other's states. And so for Minnesota, a constitutional amendment for photo ID, I believe, is a good thing for Minnesota in protecting rights and giving people the necessary access.
Okay, Representative Sanders.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One of the things throughout the testimony today, and one of the reasons why I've supported photo ID and protecting further integrity into our election system into the future, is a comment made by the Secretary of State this morning when I asked a question, what's the process for same-day registration? And it said that it took him months for them to verify same-day registrants. That's after the votes have been cast, after they've been counted, after the elections have been certified. And it's upsetting to me in some instances that we, may have to wait months to find out if ineligible people are voting in our elections. It's not the only reason that I think that photo ID is important, or having making sure that folks present valid government-issued photographic identification at the time of voting in a polling place is important. But I think it's important to know that, and folks to have belief of integrity in our system, that ineligible people to vote are not voting, and that waiting for months to verify whether or not folks that show up on the day of the polling booth is an eligible voter is, in my opinion, unacceptable for the state of Minnesota. For us to certify an election and say, we'll tag you next time, is not appropriate. So I appreciate the efforts that we're going through here. This is a change. The next legislature will have to make further changes, and I hope that we all can work in a very strong way to make sure that we include everybody that wants to vote, that deserves to vote. It is my intention that any person that is eligible to vote should be able to vote and should be able to cast a vote. And so I look forward to continuing to work in that direction and to make sure that we have a system that has more integrity and further integrity. And I believe we do a good job, but we can do a much better job, and I think that this is a step in that right direction.
Thank you, Representative Sanders. Representative Green.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have a couple comments. We've talked a lot about the process of this, but I feel as though there are just myriad unintended consequences that I want to touch on. One of them was sent to me by a constituent that I just want to highlight. The sentence, the state must issue photographic identification at no charge to an eligible voter. But there are hidden charges to voters in terms of pursuing that free ID. And in the case that this person brought up was that they're blind. So they would need to figure out the kind of taxi cab or other means of getting down to Government Center to get their free ID. Then they would need to pay an assistant to help them through the administrative process of getting that ID. So it really isn't a free ID at all. The second thing I want to mention is that, I, like many Americans, have parents who weren't born in the U.S., and so documentation can be a challenge. My mom, in particular, I think of, was born in China, and she was born before World War II, so it's a total miracle that she has her birth certificate. But the birth certificate is entirely in Chinese, even her name. And so, to require her to use that as her documentation, it just makes no sense. It doesn't add up, and I feel as though this bill just leaves a lot of gaps and has a lot of possible unintended consequences, and those are just two.
Thank you. Representative Simon.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to get to another issue. Speaking of the kind of comparisons between the states, as I already mentioned, there are 31 states that have some form of identification. Only 15 have photo ID, and of those, only 8 have a government-issued photo ID. And I just want to read here from states, and I'm only picking sort of stereotypically conservative states, so I'm not going to lay Massachusetts or California on you here. Alabama allows acceptable form of ID include, there's a long list here, this is from NCSL, and I can send it after the hearing here to every member of the committee, thanks to Mr. Gehring, who pointed it out to me. Alabama, an employee ID card, public or private, with photo. Any Alabama college or university ID with photo. Utility bill, bank statement, government check, paycheck, etc. This is not for registration. This is actually for voting. Alaska, current utility bill, bank statement, paycheck. Arizona, utility bill dated with 90 days of election. Bank or credit union statement dated within 90 days of election. Valid Arizona vehicle registration. Skip over to Florida. Student identification, neighborhood association ID. In statute, neighborhood association ID. The point, members, is many states, even conservative states with Republican conservative majorities, have understood that we need to be flexible. And this constitutional amendment, aside from the fact that it is a constitutional amendment, is not flexible. It says it has to be a government-issued photo ID. So unlike the states I just mentioned, can't have a paycheck, can't have an accredited institution of higher learning in Minnesota if it's not the U of M or a Minskew campus, so a Gustavus or a St. Olaf or a Carleton photo ID wouldn't be good enough. I just, for the life of me, and this is a question, Representative Kiffmeyer, and I think I'd really like to hear from you, and not in generalities, but in specifics, why is it that you think it needs to be government-issued photographic ID when so many other states, even conservative Republican states, have said otherwise, and that they want more flexibility? And I think this is particularly important because we are writing in permanent ink here. This is the Constitution. Once we put it in there, it might be in there forever, certainly a very, very long time. So given that, why should we be so prescriptive and so narrow?
Representative Kiffmeyer?
Thank you, Madam Chair and Representative Simon. And the question of government issued is that you have an identification that is fairly broad. I mean, government issued is quite broad. It's not prescriptive in that it only has to be Minnesota, that it could be a federal ID, could be a military ID. Those are government issued. And so I think that we have some very, very good parameters here. And the other thing is, Representative Simon, though I appreciate the source of information, many of those states have had some of those on the books for a long time, and many of those states are upgrading those ID requirements to be more fitting with government issued. The fact that we are on the level at this time with the current understanding of the need for an ID requirement. And we certainly are able to use many of those versions that you've mentioned as to residency. And again, who people are is quite consistent. Where they live is changeable. And so we've given current Minnesota law a great deal of flexibility for residency, but for identity there is a very generous amount of flexibility already in government issued, and that's why I took that position.
Well, Madam Chair, just to follow up, what, for example, would be the problem with doing, and I'm reading now Kansas. Kansas says student ID issued by an accredited post-secondary institution in Kansas, public or private. What would be wrong with requiring or allowing a student at Gustavus or St. Olaf to use that ID for purposes of voter verification? What would be the problem with that?
Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Representative Simon. I think the issue is more one of those same students generally have an ID that is attached to another state. And what we have done in government issued is that it doesn't have to be Minnesota government issued. It says it can be a government issued. So if they're a student from Wisconsin and they are claiming they're a student here and they want to vote here in Minnesota, then they are able to use that other state's ID for their identity and use the residency laws of Minnesota for their residency. I think those two fit together quite nicely for those students.
Representative Simon.
Just one last concluding comment. I appreciate that, Representative Kiffmeyer, that it's not Minnesota. I guess I would just say, you said a moment ago that some of the states that I mentioned are actually moving to tighten or at least change their requirements. And that kind of gets to my point. They can do that because it's in statute. And we won't be able to do that. And once we pass a constitutional amendment, we are writing in permanent ink. And again, there are maybe other better Minnesota historians than me. I don't know of another constitutional provision ever in over 150 years that we put in by amendment that we then subsequently have removed or even changed or altered by amendment. I don't know of it ever happening. And I don't know if Mr. Gehring does or anyone else on staff does. I don't think it has been done. The point is, this is basically permanent ink. So the beauty of having something in statute is we can come back in this highly technical field of election law and tweak and change and edit and improve. We will not be able to do that by putting such things as the word photograph, by putting such things as the word government-issued photographic identification in the Constitution. We are locked in, certainly for a generation, probably forever, and we are forfeiting the flexibility that we have by just simply doing what the 30 other states out of the 31 do, which is putting this in statute. Instead, we've opted to be like Mississippi and join them as only the second state in the country that has put this in the Constitution. I think that is a really bad move for a lot of reasons. I think members have to really think hard about putting something like this in permanent ink.
Just a couple things, Representative Simon. And I know I mentioned this before, but you went on the same line again, so I want to point out about the statutory language rather than the constitutional. We did pass that, and the governor did veto it, so that's not a route that we can take. So I just wanted to point that out for anyone watching.
Madam Chair, I have to say that's true. That was one bill. And as very often happens, sometimes there is version 2 of a bill and version 3 of the bill. It happened when the tables were turned from a partisan standpoint before. Governor Pawlenty would veto something, the first bill, and then the second bill or the third bill he would sign. And a number of us have offered and are still offering, Representative Kiffmeyer and others, to get together to work on a statute that we can actually agree on. It's a win-win. That's either poll book based or something else. So I'm not persuaded that because the governor vetoed one bill that a statutory approach is beyond all hope. I don't think that's true. I think, as in other policy areas, we can get to yes and we can get to a win-win if we have the patience. What I'm seeing now is a bill that was floated last year and that was vetoed, and there's been kind of a surrender on a statutory approach, which I think is unfortunate because we are now locking ourselves into a course with specific terms in a constitutional amendment that I think we're going to regret.
Thanks. And then you did have, Representative Simon, I think you asked something about constitutional amendments being on the ballot, and I just wanted to point out that 203 times in our history there have been ballot questions. We've got that from our staff. Representative Hornstein, you're next on the list.
Yeah. Thank you, Madam Chair. We've had some discussion both around the table here among members and then in the public that somehow we need to have this because there's fraud or there's a lack of integrity in the system. And, I was struck by some comments that our former colleague, Senator Kanak, made in the media. And it's just to refresh everyone's memory, it's not that long ago, but a few years ago he was the lawyer that was representing, the lead attorney, I believe, that was representing Senator Coleman in the recount. And so, he was paid, I think, handsomely to find fraud. That was one of the main issues, I think, in the Coleman-Franken recount. Was there fraud? And he said there's a lot of criticism, a lot of suspicion, let's say, that was generated in a Senate race. But the fact of the matter, we were looking for fraud and we didn't see it. That's what former Senator Kanak said. And, he said it again. The fact under the current system, we really haven't been seeing widespread fraud of any sort. No widespread fraud of any sort. So this is really a solution in search of a problem. So for those that think that somehow there's a lack of integrity in Minnesota's system, it's simply not the case. And really, it's the Franken-Coleman recount that's the case study of that. And to have the Republican lawyer, the person who was charged, paid very handsomely to find fraud, that was, I think, one of his missions, and didn't find it. I think they looked under every stone for it and didn't find it. I think is very, very telling why, for all the reasons that Representative Simon and others have said, this is just a bad road to go down. But certainly, we should not be under any illusion that there's fraud and that somehow this will fix fraud. It's just not the case.
Representative Quam, you're next on the list.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In regards to the recent statements, right from, again, the Stevens opinion, it remains true, however, that flagrant examples of such fraud in other parts of the country have been documented throughout this nation's history by respected historians and journalists. That occasional examples have surfaced in recent years, and that Indiana's own experience of fraudulent voting in 2003 Democratic primary in East Chicago for East Chicago mayor through perpetrated using absentee ballots and not in-person fraud demonstrate that not only is the risk of voter fraud real, but that it could affect the outcomes of close elections. That's straight from the opinion in the Supreme Court on a photo ID court case, directly relational to what we're discussing here. And if the U.S. Supreme Court acknowledges this, then I think that there must be credible evidence that it is present.
Madam Chair.
Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to respond to that, Representative Hornstein. You're exactly right. It's about the recount that he was speaking. And there's no question that we've got the recounting down. And so when you have the pre-pseudoptical scan, which I worked very hard, and I know you in the legislature in regards to working with the federal funding and all of that, so we all did work very hard. In regards to those recount rules, did many of them myself. When it comes to those recounts, I heard from Democrats, I heard from Republicans, Independence Party, Green Party, that, yeah, those recounts, with the pre-pseudoptical scan being in every precinct polling place and those things, that the counting, once they get in the ballot box, the counting of them, we've got that part of it down. And Mr. Knock, and as you say, was correct in saying, in that regard, that part of the system. But what this is about in photo ID is about the beginning of the system in voter registration and in getting the ballot. Not about counting them at the end, we got that down, but this is about getting a ballot and the accuracy and the integrity of the voter registration. I just want to see that same level of integrity that we've talked about there at the end of the system, that we do the same level of integrity and protection of access up front.
Thank you. Representative Winkler, did you have a question?
Madam Chair, Representative Kiffmeyer, I'm not going to go back to the questions because they're not really, I've actually just come to the conclusion that it's not that you won't answer them or that you can't answer them, it's just that the amendment that you're drafting just leaves a lot of gaping holes and questions. You've made a lot of promises today. You made promises to the AARP, you made a promise to ARC, you made promises about the cost of IDs. Earlier today you made promises about the ability to provide voter education. You've made a lot of representations about how everything is going to go so well and it won't be a problem and we'll just be able to make this all work. Yet there's people in the room who are currently challenging in court Minnesota law for guardianship and how guardianship works under the Constitution. So you can very well sit here and make promises that you're going to be a good person and work with everybody to make sure that every vote is counted, as Representative Sanders so wonderfully said, but there are plenty of people who are going to be out there bringing lawsuits against counties, against the state, in order to interpret all of the language in this bill that really doesn't mean very much on its face. This substantially equivalent language doesn't come from the Supreme Court. That wasn't the issue in the Crawford case. There's language that says at no charge, but we don't know what at no charge means. We don't know if that means when you get a birth certificate, we don't know if that means you get a ride to the poll. We don't know what standard that is. We don't know what the word valid means. Valid government-issued photographic identification. I don't know what the word valid means. All these words that you're putting in here in an attempt to cram a constitutional amendment into a statutory framework just doesn't work. The Supreme Court was interpreting a state statute with many provisions. You were trying to pick out little pieces of those things from the Supreme Court language and somehow make them work in a concise fashion in a constitutional amendment. But it is going to be a disaster because every group on the left and the right is going to be in litigation from now until eternity trying to figure out what all these words mean. And here's how it will work. The legislature may or may not pass enabling legislation. The governor may or may not sign it. We may have an election, and somebody will say, well, you're not following the constitutional requirements, so the election has to stop. And then somebody else will say, well, okay, so go ahead and try to do something. And somebody else will sue and say, well, I don't know. I don't think this is substantially equivalent. I don't think you're allowing to do this. I don't think this ID was really free. I don't think this ID was really valid. And you're opening yourself up to suit and countersuit from here until the end of the world, and it's all because you won't deal with this as a statute. We have offered an alternative. You have successfully quashed any attempt from Republicans to actually deal with this on that issue. Congratulations. Members, your party loyalty is solid, and you all managed to ride into disaster together, so that's good. But the problem is that you have a statute. You have an issue that belongs in a statute because it's complex, it's complicated, it's long, it takes a lot of things to make it valid, and you're trying to shoehorn it into these few little words, and all you're doing is guaranteeing that there will be long litigation and endless lawsuits over what all of these little words mean, and you're going to be throwing our election system into far greater doubt than it's in currently. If you want to make sure that people don't trust the election system, throw this whole thing into further litigation and chaos, and then you can guarantee that nobody will trust it. It's a great way to drive down turnout. It's a great way to deliver votes for one political party if that's the goal. You're doing an admirable job of ruining the election system in Minnesota through this constitutional amendment approach. There are sensible ways that we can address many of the concerns that you have, but this is just a disaster in slow motion. I really would wonder why on earth party loyalty or the aggressive tactics, I would only assume, of certain outside interest groups would force you into opening yourselves up to this kind of disaster when a reasonable alternative exists to actually give you the photo verification that you want. You are all going down together, I guess, and it may pass, but you are not going to achieve anything except well, it'll be good for lawyers, Representative Simon. It'll be good for people who get paid to bring lawsuits to challenge election law. And maybe that's where the ultimate interest lies here. I don't know. But it won't be good for the election system. It won't be good for any of you. And it won't be good for us.
Before I turn it over to Representative Kiffmeyer, we'll take some final comments, questions. Representative Simon?
Just one thing. I had to address page 2 of the actual bill. I just want to caution, I didn't offer an amendment here, but if we're going to have a constitutional amendment, Representative Kiffmeyer, this is an engraved invitation for a lawsuit. As you probably know, there's Minnesota Supreme Court authority right on point that the question that you put to the voters has to accurately reflect what's in the actual constitutional amendment. It can't just be a sales job or a propaganda statement about everything that's good about it. There's nothing in here about government issue. The question that you're proposing that goes to Minnesota voters on the ballot says just requiring all voters to present valid photo ID. That's not an accurate or truthful reflection of this. So an engraved invitation for a lawsuit unless you put government issued, in my opinion. It also doesn't make clear that it's only at a polling place. And probably biggest of all, there's nothing in here about the brand new, never in 150 years tried in Minnesota provisional ballot system. I would bet my next paycheck that if you don't have all three of those and maybe more details in there, it is a unanimous Minnesota Supreme Court decision that this is just a bumper sticker propaganda statement about the merits of the bill and not an accurate description of the bill. Those three are very substantive parts about your proposal. I may disagree with the proposal, but that's part of your proposal, government issued, at a polling place, and provisional ballot. Instead, there's a there's a phrase here that's being proposed to Minnesota voters, which is just kind of a sales pitch and not an accurate description.
Anyone else that would need to talk before we turn it over to Representative Kiffmeyer for final words?
Just that, Madam Chair.
Representative Nelson?
Request a roll call.
Roll call having been requested, there will be a roll call, but before that, I would like to have Representative Kiffmeyer, the author of the bill, make some brief closing comments.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The time being late, I am sympathetic to you, and we've already had a lot of discussion with comments already made. Just want to emphasize that in the U.S. Supreme Court, in looking at their decision and the components of both Indiana and the U.S. Supreme Court, that this constitutional amendment gives us the flexibility needed to include those constitutional requirements in our implementation of photo ID. The issues of at-no-charge ID are especially helpful to the poor. Can't emphasize that enough. That's why Andrew Young, former African-American mayor of Atlanta, Georgia, supported it. And from that community in particular, I think it is really important that this is especially valuable to them and engaging them not only in the election process, but also in the economy in general. Currently, we have eligibility verification, but only on Election Day after the ballot is cast. That is why I believe that nearly 80% of Minnesotans support photo ID, because they themselves go to the polling place and they vote. They have personal experience with the election process. They have personal experience with voting absentee. They have that personal experience. And I believe because of that, that is why there is such a strong support amongst the citizens for a photo ID requirement. It is so commonplace that even in voting in the union, they use a photo ID to get government benefits, to check in your composting at the county or city entity. In your regular daily life, every citizen has personal experience with using a photo ID and government issued. And so that is why I believe that the voters will support this amendment, and why I also believe that working with all of the entities that have testified here today, that we will make sure that every single Minnesotan eligible to vote has that ID and is compliant and will be supportive of this amendment. And members, I ask for your vote. Thank you.
At this time, I will renew my motion that House File 2738, as amended, be recommended to pass and be re-referred to the Committee on Ways and Means. The clerk will take the roll.
Representative Pepin.
Aye.
Representative Murray.
Aye.
Representative Nelson.
No.
Representative Green.
No.
Representative Hancock.
Aye.
Representative Hornstein.
No.
Representative McFarland. Representative O'Driscoll.
Aye.
Representative Quam.
Aye.
Representative Sanders.
Aye.
Representative Scalzi.
No.
Representative Simon.
No.
Representative Erdahl.
Aye.
Representative Winkler.
No.
Representative Beard.
Aye.
There being 9 ayes and 6 nays, the motion does prevail. Members, I just wanted to remind you that we are having a Friday hearing tomorrow at 9 a.m. in the usual spot. Meeting adjourned.